The Adeptus Administratum originated as a bureaucratic necessity during the early consolidation of the Imperium, but its conceptual roots were established long before the first official records mention its name. Following the Unification Wars and the onset of the Great Crusade, the fledgling Imperium required a centralized administrative body to manage the rapid expansion of territory, logistics, military deployments, census taking, and planetary compliance. The function of organizing and recording the vast machinery of human civilization fell to a class of men and women specifically trained in calculation, governance, and ledgercraft. While the Imperium was still young, these individuals operated under different names and branches, chiefly as scribes and archivists attached to the greater offices of Terra. But with the Great Crusade came formal codification. Under the Primarch Robute Guilliman's realm-wide administrative initiatives and the Emperor's silent endorsement, the Adeptus Administratum was officially established during the later stages of the Crusade, centered in the immense megalopolis of the Imperial Palace on Holy Terra. As the Imperium expanded across thousands of worlds, so too did the Administratum. It quickly became the largest single organ of the Adeptus Terra, functioning as the grand central nervous system of the Imperium's logistical operations. Its reach extended to every compliant world, every tithe schedule, every military supply route, and every piece of cogitator-fed information flowing back to Terra. Entire hive cities became mere outposts for the Administratum's endless documentation. It was never designed to be lean or efficient. Instead, its architecture was built to endure. Redundancy was virtue. Slowness was safety. What began as an essential administrative tool became a religious and bureaucratic monolith, one whose internal language of forms, stamps, and glyphs eventually developed into its own culture. Despite being composed entirely of humans, the Adeptus Administratum exhibits a unique biological selection process over time. While membership is technically open to any Imperial citizen, with the aptitude to serve, its inner circles are self-selecting. Scribes are often recruited in childhood from scolums, orphanages, or debtor families, chosen for mental endurance over physical strength. The typical Administratum functionary is below average in height and builds no muscular frame. Their eyes, dulled by years of staring at luminous data slates or yellowed parchment, often require augmentation by their third or fourth decade. It is common to find mid-level scribes entirely dependent on cogitator uplinks, bionic fingers, or cranial data jacks to perform their daily tasks. Physical infirmity is not seen as a limitation, but as proof of unwavering devotion. Certain senior adepts have not left their desks in over 100 years, their organs preserved by primitive life-sustaining implants and chemical balms. The vast majority of these individuals are sterile, either through bureaucratic decree, workplace hazards, or genetic deterioration from thousands of years of isolation within data vaults. Reproduction is rare and usually unintentional. Instead, the Administratum sustains itself through constant conscription from lower echelons of Imperial society. Families sometimes surrender children in exchange for financial or legal debt relief, especially on hive worlds where labor is currency. In these cases, the child is conditioned to value order, accuracy, and silence. Over time, this cultural conditioning becomes biological norm. The end result is a class of human almost divorced from normal sensory existence, pale-skinned, hunched, near blind, and wholly uninterested in personal ambition beyond clerical rank. In the context of military power, the Adeptus Administratum is rarely seen on the battlefield, yet its influence shapes every engagement. The Office of Tithes determines how many regiments are raised from each world. The Departmentum Munitorum, a sub-branch often mistakenly considered separate, is in fact a specialized division of the Administratum. It allocates munitions, determines the supply lines, calculates fuel consumption, and ensures that each company of the Astra Militarum has both bullets and rations. While lacking traditional combat divisions, the Administratum fields enforcement units, often dull-eyed men and women armed with las pistols and empowered to compel obedience through bureaucratic threat. In rare cases, scribes accompany frontline troops as observers, tasked with recording events for compliance auditing. These scribes are not expected to survive. They are expected to return data, alive or recovered posthumously. The doctrine of the Adeptus Administratum is one of cold precision. Its tactics are administrative, not combative. A single delayed requisition form can doom a war effort. A misplaced decimal in a tithe calculation can lead to a planetary revolt. The administrators understand this, and they use it as leverage. Systems that underperform can be cut off from necessary resources. Sectors that rebel may find their existence erased from official charts, rendering them invisible to Imperial reinforcements. Whole wars have been won or lost through paperwork. It is a common axiom within the Administratum that ink kills more surely than bolter fire. The internal social structure of the Adeptus Administratum is rigid and hierarchical. It resembles the hive worlds from which many of its members are drawn. At the base are the penitent scribes, data slaves, and junior clerks who perform endless transcription. Above them are the department heads, their faces covered by vox shrouds to indicate status. Ascending further are the senior adepti, each of whom controls hundreds of subordinate cells, often without knowing what their workers are recording. At the peak sit the High Lords liaison offices, administrative priests in direct contact with the Senatorum Imperialis. Promotion is slow and based not on merit but endurance. Many rise in rank only after their superiors die at their desks. Culturally, the Administratum values silence, obedience, and completion. Rituals include the binding of fingers in red ribbon before transcription, whisper prayers to St. Drusus of the Ledger, and the annual recitation of the Great Tithe Cycle. Ethics revolve around doctrinal truth and compliance. Internal divisions exist between different departmental schools. Some prize digital cogitation, others insist on parchment-only fidelity. These disputes have resulted in recorded fistfights over ink type or lexicon phrasing. Some divisions even label others heretical for using outdated filing formats. The philosophy of the Adeptus Administratum views information as divine. Data is not merely a tool, it is a sacred artifact to be purified, stored, and transmitted without corruption. Tampering with records is viewed as both criminal and sinful. Administratum tech differs from other Imperial systems. Machines used by scribes are often ancient cogitators the size of tanks, with brass-plated keypads and skull-wreathed terminals. They are maintained not by tech priests, but by transcription engineers who speak binary liturgies passed down by word of mouth. Data is not transferred wirelessly, but etched into wax-coded memory sticks, hand-carried across vault corridors in procession. Among the notable figures of the Administratum was Tarsius Graven, who in Millennia 37 restructured the tithe schedule for 3,000 agri-worlds and allegedly caused a famine on 300 hive planets as a result. There was also Holy Matriarch Volussa, a blind adept who processed and approved over 400 million reports during her tenure. She was later canonized by decree after collapsing in her chair mid-sentence. More controversially, Lord Darnath Vexos, an architect of the Exterminatus Policy Review Board, was accused of omitting defense fleets from charted records, thereby facilitating chaos incursions. His trial spanned 187 years, after which he was cleared of all charges due to a missing index slip. The behavioural tendencies of Administratum personnel lean toward obsessive-compulsive. Many adepts speak in fragments, echoing the format of forms. Social interaction is limited to daily affirmations and quota reviews. Disruption of routine is deeply distressing. Functionaries who experience multiple record mismatches often suffer breakdowns, some of which are fatal. To counter this, the Adeptus Administratum sponsors the use of sedation incense, chanting cycles, and enforced prayer silences. Promotions sometimes include mandatory mind wipes to eliminate deviant thought. While not all divisions practice rituals, some major branches conduct seasonal purgations, where outdated records are burned and replaced in mass rites. Others engage in the triennial ink blessing, an event during which the first drop of new ink is placed on the forehead of the junior scribe who achieved perfect compliance the previous year. The caste system within the Administratum is rigid, but not hereditary. Status is earned through exhaustion, not inheritance. Division is enforced by office location, robe colour or dialect, all of which indicate one's role in the endless war for order. The Adeptus Administratum is not a shining monument of imperial virtue. It is a battered, blood-soaked engine of compliance, operating not in pursuit of justice or glory, but continuity. It is the will of the Imperium made data. The concept of a civilian life within the Adeptus Administratum is almost paradoxical. Most of its members do not possess a traditional understanding of personal freedom or identity. Civilian roles blur into clerical functions, with housing, nourishment and leisure structured entirely around the requirements of the bureaucratic apparatus. A low-tier scribe may spend an entire life within the same administrative sector, living in monastic dorms beneath the record vaults, consuming nutrient paste provided during sanctioned breaks and interacting only through voice-authorized terminals. Outside of Terra, many Administratum outposts establish isolated enclaves that operate as self-contained cities, complete with internal economies, reproduction protocols, and caste-based governance. These enclaves are not designed for cultural flourishing but for clerical longevity. Even on major hive worlds such as Necromunda or Armageddon, Administratum enclaves operate with a cultural separation from surrounding populations. They are seen as both revered and resented, protected by imperial decree yet loathed for the burden they impose. Planetary governors often regard them as unavoidable parasites, necessary to maintain imperial compliance but dangerous if offended. An unverified anecdote from the Segmentum Obscurus details how a local planetary militia refused to escort a shipment of tithe records during a civil conflict, resulting in the Administratum declaring the entire governor's bloodline in breach of imperial accounting mandates. Within 24 standard months, the world was subjected to administrative quarantine, followed by imperial fist blockade. The planet's name was later erased from official charts. The tools and technologies utilized by the Adeptus Administratum serve functions vastly different from those found in combat-focused branches of the Imperium. The Lex Mechanic is a prime example, a human-machine hybrid designed to interface with ancient cogitators at speeds no unaugmented human can match. These individuals are hardwired into data thrones, suspended by metallic armatures while processing 1,000 forms per hour. Their minds are constantly bombarded by data requests, error pings, and line-by-line compliance reviews. If they die during operation, which is not uncommon, the system continues running until a shutdown directive is manually inserted. Lex mechanics are not mourned, they are catalogued. Another widely used tool is the servo scribe, a floating drone covered in quills, parchment rollers, and stamping devices. Programmed to shadow high-ranking clerks, these machines record every spoken order, conversation, and breath. Their internal memory can store over 300 standard years' worth of data, encrypted in a script only understood by the Order of Seal Keepers. Tampering with a servo scribe is considered a crime of transnumerical falsification, a charge punishable by brain erasure. Other common devices include the Auspex abacus, a mechanical calculator used for population recounts, and the thought detainer, a psycho-inductive collar worn by junior adepts to prevent cognitive deviation during periods of data fatigue. The philosophy governing the design of these technologies is one of infallibility through redundancy. Most systems are backed by at least 3 fail-safes, including manual override seals, biometric locks, and ceremonial approval rituals. A single document may pass through the hands of 27 different individuals before being archived, and each stage is logged in triplicate. In some divisions, a basic requisition form requires authentication by 4 separate departments, not due to distrust, but to ensure divine errorlessness. This obsessive redundancy often results in decade-long approval processes, but within the Administratum, speed is not a virtue, certainty is. The physical architecture of the Administratum mirrors its internal processes. Most record vaults are built into subterranean catacombs beneath imperial cities, guarded by steel gates etched with anti-demonic wards and layered with dust several meters thick. The vaults of Terra, especially the Basilica Administratum, contain rooms so large they generate their own wind currents. Shelves stretch vertically for kilometers, and some are accessible only via grave chains or elevator platforms operated by chant codes. Light is minimal, supplied by lumen globes that burn with chemical fire to preserve humidity levels. Many vaults still contain documents written before the Horus Heresy, protected in air-sealed reliquaries and monitored by drones that have not received new instructions in 10,000. Not all vaults are static. Some records are stored in mobile archive trains, hundreds of cars long, travelling permanently across Forge World rail networks or void ships retrofitted as roving data sanctuaries. These mobile record units exist partly to prevent information concentration, but also due to theological disagreements over vault consecration rites. Different sects within the Administratum argue about which locations are suitable for divine record housing. Entire bureaucratic wars have been fought over archival jurisdiction, involving decades of back-and-forth petitions and occasional violent purges. The leadership hierarchy within the Administratum is intentionally opaque, but at its theoretical peak lies the Master of the Administratum, one of the High Lords of Terra. While this position is traditionally ceremonial, meant to represent the uppermost administrative authority, it occasionally becomes the centre of real political power. In times of crisis, such as during the Age of Apostasy, or the aftermath of the 13th Black Crusade, the Master of the Administratum has issued decrees that redirected planetary resources, reassigned military forces, and even overruled lesser inquisitorial operations. However, most masters remain insulated, operating as figures of symbolic stability, while real decision-making power lies with senior sublords, known as the Lord Data Executors. Below them are hundreds of sector-level premiordines, each responsible for overseeing administration in an entire segmentum or subsector. These individuals rarely leave their chambers, often relying on intermediary speak servitors and sealed communiques to interact with subordinates. The majority of daily operations are managed by senior arch-logisticians, who coordinate divisions of 3 to 10,000 personnel. Promotion to this level requires the successful administration of a planetary tithe cycle, the completion of the ritual of absolute audit and, on occasion, surviving a sanctioned internal investigation. Not all rise by merit. In many cases, high rank is achieved only after the assassination, disappearance, or mental collapse of one's superiors. While to outsiders the Administratum appears monolithic, internally it is a complex ecosystem of rivalry, cooperation and tradition. Departments often compete for jurisdictional dominance. Auditors from one division may attempt to sabotage the metrics of another to gain favour with higher officers. Religious schisms occur over data purity practices. In one case, 2 entire archival units declared heresy over differing interpretations of the phrase "sufficiently compliant," leading to a century-long doctrinal Cold War. Such internal tensions are not viewed as flaws, but as manifestations of the system's vitality. Conflict sharpens compliance, discord exposes flaws. Even in this structured chaos, there exists the rare emergence of a reformist. Some adepts, usually near the end of their service lives, attempt to modernize, streamline, or otherwise improve the mechanisms of the Adeptus Administratum. Most fail. Their proposals are buried under audit reviews, redirected to sub-departments, or classified under procedural embargo. A few are accused of innovationism, a term used internally to describe those who attempt to deviate from established formats. Innovationism is not officially banned, but it is considered spiritually suspect. Reformers often vanish before their proposals are reviewed. As a result, the Adeptus Administratum endures not through adaptability, but through immobility. It does not evolve, it ossifies. Like a mountain of stone growing layer by layer, the Administratum builds itself taller, not by tearing down the old, but by placing new forms atop the dead weight of previous ones. Its strength lies not in brilliance, but in its absolute refusal to collapse. The cultural and philosophical framework of the Adeptus Administratum is not guided by personal ambition or intellectual exploration, but by an ingrained submission to continuity. Thought is structured to conform, not to challenge. Training begins with rote memorization of ancient forms and catechisms. Recruits are drilled not in creative problem-solving, but in ritual compliance. Deviations are discouraged even when justified, and initiative is often punished unless it perfectly aligns with precedent. The result is a class of humans conditioned to believe that obedience to the ledger is equivalent to obedience to the emperor. It is not uncommon for junior adepts to flagellate themselves for accidentally misaligning a data column, or for entire teams to perform ritual penance due to a processing backlog beyond their control. The ethical code of the Administratum is shaped by this same logic. Morality is procedural, not moral in the conventional sense. Actions are deemed good or evil based on their compliance with regulation and their contribution to broader administrative objectives. For example, the late processing of a planetary food tithe may be considered a greater sin than the starvation of that planet's population, if the delay interrupts larger production chains in another segmentum. Similarly, the premature destruction of an archived file, regardless of whether it contains irrelevant or outdated data, is considered a sacrilege under Imperial Decree 17.5 and has resulted in the public execution of entire auditing teams. Intent carries little weight. Consequences are measured by impact on administrative throughput. Ritual behaviour within the Adeptus Administratum is both spiritual and operational. A great number of procedural acts are accompanied by ceremonial rites, not out of reverence, but as mandated components of successful execution. Activating a sector-level data vault, for instance, requires the recitation of the invocation of authorized access, a monotone chant performed over 111 seconds, while the adept's right palm is pressed against a sanctified sigil plate. The process is not optional. In some vaults, access will not be granted unless the correct chant resonance matches previously archived voice prints. These rituals act as a cross between security measures, cultural reinforcements, and theological compliance checkpoints. Another common ritual is the rite of error correction, performed when any clerical mistake is discovered. The act involves 3 steps: a written confession logged under the individual's birth record, a physical punishment determined by the local penal liturgist, and a symbolic cleansing of the cogitator unit with blessed unguent. While this practice might appear superstitious, it plays a critical role in reinforcing individual accountability within a system too large to monitor each action independently. The fear of error becomes the enforcement mechanism. In this way, the Administratum maintains discipline without relying solely on external punishment. Internal caste divisions are maintained through both tradition and operational necessity. While the formal hierarchy is dictated by rank and clearance level, unofficial castes are created through training lineage, ritual alignment, or even office location. An adept trained under the Order of Glass numerals may never be considered for a transfer to the Ivory Ledger division, regardless of competence, due to an ancient theological disagreement over data notation that originated on Terra 7,000 years ago. These invisible walls are respected and preserved even when they no longer serve any logical function. Within the Administratum, logic is not the arbiter of structure. Precedent is. Behavioral instincts among Administratum personnel are conditioned, not innate. Over time, adepts begin to display reflexive behaviors that make integration into non-administrative environments nearly impossible. For example, most senior officials speak in fragmented code phrases, mixing Gothic with datastream shorthand. Some lose the ability to interpret casual speech altogether. Psychological assessments of long-term Administratum workers have shown a progressive flattening of affect, reduced emotional response to suffering, and heightened sensitivity to irregular fonts or misaligned document formatting. These adaptations are seen internally as signs of purity. Some rare individuals within the institution rise to legendary status, not for feats of strength or charisma, but for the scale and perfection of their administrative control. One such figure was Quastus Verlin, known as the One Who Indexed Eternity. Over a period of 917 years, he personally authenticated every item within the subsector Helissar Monitorum Flow Archive, a data repository spanning 5 planets. At the conclusion of his task, he petitioned for mind erasure and was granted ascension to Servitor-class Saint. Another was Linova Hesh, credited with redesigning the tithe approval flow of Segmentum Pacificus into a model that remains in use, unaltered, 10,000 years later. These figures are not revered for human qualities, but for their near-mechanical perfection. The values of the Adeptus Administratum are therefore best described as a codified anti-ego. Selfhood is a liability. To stand out is to risk deviation. The ideal member is invisible, perfectly interchangeable, and indistinguishable from the function they perform. This is reflected even in attire. Robes are color-coded by division, but never ornamented. Personal customization is discouraged unless part of a sanctioned ritual. The only acceptable display of individuality is the acquisition of additional stamps or classification seals, status markers earned not through personality but through record volume. Technology within the Adeptus Administratum is deeply conservative. The aesthetic is archaic, even by Imperial standards. Terminals are mechanical, displays are often analog. Energy use is minimized to avoid waste, and many systems rely on hand-cranked backup power in case of outage. Data is often stored on parchment as a failsafe against digital corruption, and backup copies are written in blood ink when sanctity is required. Even the most advanced equipment, such as the machine mind census calculators, are designed to appear ancient, shrouded in sculpted brass and adorned with purity seals. This design ethos is not simply cosmetic, it is a theological affirmation that all knowledge must be preserved through reverence, not innovation. The philosophical outlook of the Adeptus Administratum views history as not merely informative, but prescriptive. Every recorded event is a blueprint for future action. New problems must be solved using old solutions. Novelty is not a goal, but a risk. This cultural philosophy extends even into interstellar policy. If a system has failed to deliver its tithe, but records indicate that a similar failure occurred 6,000 years prior, the recommended response will mirror that event, regardless of current context. In this way, the past is not consulted but obeyed. This reverence for recorded precedent leads to strange and sometimes devastating outcomes. A notable case occurred in the Centaur Nebula, where a Forge world failed to submit its automated production logs for a period of 5 decades. Rather than investigate, Administratum officials consulted similar emissions from 10,000 years prior and determined that the planet had likely been destroyed in a warp storm. A reclassification form was filed, and the planet was removed from all logistical chains. In reality, the Forge world had survived and continued production, but without proper designation, its exports were treated as illegal and eventually raided by the Imperial Navy as contraband. The error was only corrected 3 centuries later, after a bored adept stumbled upon the discrepancy while researching an unrelated tithe variance. Yet despite its flaws, the Adeptus Administratum is the reason the Imperium can even pretend to function. In a realm where time bends, communications are distorted, and entire sectors disappear into the warp, the Administratum maintains a baseline of operational coherence. It does not aspire to perfection. It defines perfection as the maintenance of what already exists. For this institution, survival is not merely its own success, but the only success worth measuring. Within the endless maze of the Adeptus Administratum, where identity is erased beneath protocol and bureaucracy, a rare few have emerged as defining figures, not due to power in the conventional sense, but due to their impact on the machine of governance itself. These individuals are not remembered for charisma or bold actions, but for the sheer weight of their administrative influence. They serve as archetypes of perfection within the Imperium's most unyielding institution, and many are canonized not in faith but in record. One such figure was Amon Siculus, Grand Master of the Segmentum Obscurus Filing Temple, during the final years of Millennia 38. Known as the Chronophage, he instituted a new timekeeping doctrine that recalibrated the Administratum's entire event logging methodology. The change was so widespread that certain naval campaigns, retroactively misdated by the update, were declared unrecorded and stripped of honours, as they now technically never occurred. Though despised by many commanders, Siculus's reforms remain in place, his logic backed by an irrefutable 30-volume treatise written in archaeolexicant, updated every standard decade. Another was Sarah Altamos, whose entire recorded output consisted of 3 words: transfer authority ratified. As head of the Transphalanx Ascendant Ledger in the Ultima Segmentum, she refused to speak or write anything beyond this phrase, issuing all approvals and refusals via calibrated ink stamps pre-coded with thousands of possible directives. Though believed to be entirely mute, she processed more resource orders in 40 years than any other official in recorded history. Her behaviour was later adopted as a devotional model for silence-based indexing cults on Mars and Terra. While many high-ranking officials within the Administratum are never seen by the public, their existence shapes galactic-scale outcomes. High Lord Tacticae Varnak Thule, an immortalised presence on the Senatorum Imperialis during the final stages of the War of the Beast, was instrumental in halting military operations due to projected spreadsheet overruns. Though the decision allowed Orc forces to overrun 3 sectors, his reallocation of material led to the foundation of 3 new Titan legions 2 centuries later. His actions are now cited in training manuals under the doctrine of temporal resource exchange, a principle that teaches adepts to prioritize eternal gain over momentary victory. The technology that underpins such decisions is not reactive, but deterministic. It is designed not to interpret the future, but to enforce the past. Many of the Administratum's most advanced systems are actually ancient, maintained not through understanding but through tradition and reverence. The Macroratio Logisticum engine housed on Terra, built during the earliest days of the Great Crusade, is still used to cross-reference supply chains across 10,000 planets. Its original programming code is no longer understood. Instead, adepts feed it offerings of wax tablets and scrap code chant sheets, hoping for coherent replies, which are then interpreted by oracular teams trained in pattern divination. These machines are often not machines in the contemporary sense, but relic shrines wrapped in layers of superstition and fail-safe theology. The presence of servitors, tech priests, and incense-laced maintenance rituals is constant. The deeper one ventures into the administrative tech layers, the more blurred the line becomes between operating the machine and worshipping it. The Administratum does not innovate, it reinterprets. New needs are not met with new solutions, but with modified applications of previously canonized procedure. Within this framework, the behavioral instincts of Administratum personnel become both a cultural identity and a survival mechanism. The act of questioning a superior's directive is a formal heresy in many divisions. The failure to follow ritual, even when the outcome is positive, is classified as deviationism. Repeated acts of optimization can trigger demotion or punishment, as they threaten the fragile balance of systemic inertia. Paradoxically, the most successful adepts are often those who adapt by not adapting, who flourish by aligning completely with immobility. Entire departments exist solely to track deviationism patterns and root out employees whose efficiency suggests non-standard behavior. The result is a living machine whose components are human, but whose soul is ossified doctrine. Social mobility within the Adeptus Administratum is both fluid and non-existent. While promotions can occur, often rapidly, they do not grant freedom or prestige, only the burden of overseeing larger blocks of stability. Some adepts rise to become subsector coordinators, or even segmentum archivists, but their lives grow smaller as their scope increases. They rarely leave their sanctums. They stop speaking in casual tongue. Some interface directly with their cogitators, replacing spoken word with click patterns and retinal glyphs. These individuals are not corrupted by power, but hollowed by duty. There are also informal castes determined not by skill, but by legacy. Lineage among Data families is real. Certain families have provided Administratum personnel for tens of thousands of years, their names etched into the column logs of entire office blocks. These hereditary roles are not noble but functional, A family that has indexed air traffic logistics for 6,000 years on a single agri-world is considered more authoritative than any external expert, even if that family's literacy is confined to flight manifest protocols. This generational ritualism is considered a form of cultural purification. To deviate from it is to risk losing one's place in the sacred chain of documentation. Hierarchy within the Administratum is enforced through both structure and secrecy. The most powerful figures often remain unnamed, their authority passed through mimetic chains, encoded glyphs, or relay adepts who do not know their source. Orders arrive with no return address. Initiatives are launched with no clear architect. This obfuscation is not accidental. It is an integral part of the bureaucracy's resilience. By diffusing power across layers of untraceable command, the Administratum ensures that no single failure can collapse the entire system. Even extermination events that wipe out entire subdivisions have little lasting effect. Another team, somewhere else, will continue the same task using mirrored protocols. The internal logic of the Administratum views the galaxy as fundamentally unstable and unpredictable. Therefore, the only rational response is to create a structure so dense, so repetitive, and so universally enforced that it becomes immune to entropy. That is the great lie and genius of the institution. It does not resist the decay of the Imperium. It absorbs that decay and repackages it as operational cost. A planet may burn, a fleet may vanish, but if the event is correctly logged, categorized, and archived, then the system continues. Every cogitator entry, every burned offering to a data vault, every name listed on a tithe form destined never to be read. These are the tools with which the Adeptus Administratum holds together an empire that should have collapsed 10,000 years ago. The institution is not made of men or machines. It is made of ritual, precedent, and fear. Its true power is not that it serves the Imperium, but that the Imperium cannot imagine surviving without it. The earliest known entries referencing a centralized administrative authority within the human galactic diaspora originate from preserved records attributed to the Dark Age of technology. These references are fragmented, often stored in corrupted data crypts or translated from pre-Imperial Terran dialects. Among these scattered sources is a fragmented array from the orbiting technoliths of old Earth, dated to the final century before the Age of Strife, which makes mention of a global oversight complex that regulated material flows across orbital colonies and interstellar assets. While these documents cannot be definitively linked to the Adeptus Administratum as it exists in the current age, Inquisition analysis suggests that these were ancestral systems, later repurposed during the rise of the Emperor. By the end of the Unification Wars on Terra, the need for absolute logistical command became not merely a convenience, but a necessity. The Emperor's Great Crusade, which commenced in Millennia 30, year 798, required a scale of resource coordination unseen in any prior human endeavour. It was during the early phases of the Crusade that the Emperor tasked Malcador the Sigillite and his early Terran technocrats to develop a comprehensive system capable of managing not only the requisition and distribution of military assets, but also the integration of compliant worlds into a singular imperial ledger. This directive resulted in the creation of the first proto-administratum, simply called the Order of Human Accountancy, housed in data forges beneath the Himalasian mountains. It was not until after the Siege of Terra and the subsequent events of the Horus Heresy that the Adeptus Administratum, by then fully titled and recognized as such, became autonomous in function. With the Emperor interred within the Golden Throne, and the Imperial governance transitioning into the High Lord system, the Administratum was officially ratified as one of the primary pillars of Imperial function. The infamous conquest of Journai in Segmentum Pacificus, for example, was resolved administratively in only 13 hours. The war itself lasted 7 weeks, but the planetary value assessment, resource redirection, and population indenture occurred before the first shot was fired. These actions were logged under Alpha Tithe Mandate A2357-8, later copied into over 4,000 sub-theatres of conquest. The second founding of the Space Marines in Millennia 31, year 017, was the first major imperial decree processed entirely by the modern administratum without the emperor's direct input. Tithe readjustments, personnel allocations, and naval armada commissions tied to the second founding generated over 700,000 new administrative subdivisions, many of which remain active today. The earliest significant error in the institution's history is formally recorded in the Segmentum Tempestus Echo debacle, dated to millennia 32, year 488. The administratum, due to misaligned data crypt clocks during a synchronization event, classified a supply fleet containing several billion tons of promethium and last munitions as archaeo-industrial refuse, and redirected it into a decommissioned warp gate scheduled for collapse. The destruction of the fleet resulted in the loss of a year-long crusade into the Ghost Moon sector, forcing a retreat that cost the lives of over 300,000 Imperial Guard regiments. The Administratum's response was to archive the incident under a sealed codex titled Logisticum Delay Grade Non-Executable, which was not reopened for analysis until millennia 36. Throughout the next several millennia, the Adeptus Administratum's influence expanded beyond its original remit. No longer simply a data-handling institution, it became a gatekeeper of imperial action. By millennia 35, any planetary governor requesting reinforcements, tithe reductions, or even atmospheric re-terraforming had to pass through no fewer than 17 administrative layers. The subsector disaster of Helicon Primus is a prime example of this process. In the year 235 of millennia 35, a hive world located near a critical trade artery fell into civil war and chemical collapse. A call for aid was issued and received by a local administratum relay vault. The relay clerks completed their standard verification, countercheck, and duplicate transcript requirements. The request arrived at Terra 23 years later. By then, the planet was already classified as Agri Redevelopment Candidate and rezoned for biomass recovery. In stark contrast, the institution's record during the Plague Wars of millennia 41 was a rare case of logistical excellence. When Mortarion and the Death Guard invaded Ultramar, the Imperium's ability to mount a coordinated defense hinged not on the warriors themselves, but on supply stabilization. The Adeptus Administratum coordinated emergency planetary reroutes for over 100,000 shipments of medical supplies, Astra Militarum reinforcements, and orbital payloads. The Lapis Index Vault, a high-function calculus shrine orbiting Nova Terrax, predicted the pathogen's vector curves 3 days before primary planetary impact. This allowed supply columns to pre-position along escape and response corridors. Though nearly 36 worlds were lost, several critical core systems were saved, an outcome later attributed directly to Administratum foresight. Such events underscore the institution's dual nature, one of precision and permanence, but also of fragility under its own weight. Inquisitorial audits conducted in millennia 41 suggest that approximately 12% of all planetary records held by the Adeptus Administratum are either duplicated, contradictory, or irrecoverably lost. Yet despite these errors, no viable replacement exists. The very idea of reform is considered heretical. On Vostroya, an attempt to introduce streamlined data stream updates led to 300 arrests for abandonment of orthodoxy, with punishment ranging from data retraining to cerebral purification. The Administratum's most famous planetary stabilization operation in recent memory is the Dawn Ration Initiative on Baal following the devastation by Hive Fleet Leviathan. While the Blood Angels fought for survival, Administratum functionaries initiated a ration ledger system capable of feeding displaced populations across 9 neighbouring worlds. This ledger was constructed from the remains of a Titan fortress's central cortex, converted into a planetary ration computation matrix. Under the direction of Archive Senior Velthron Narek, the operation succeeded in preventing starvation and unrest, even as war continued overhead. The system was later declared sacred and stored in the vaults of Ophelia Seventh. The sheer volume of documentation that has emerged from 10,000 years of bureaucratic oversight defies quantification. Data vaults on Terra alone contain over 1 trillion codified tithe summaries, dating back to the earliest years of the Imperium. These records are not simply historical, they are weaponized. In the War of the False Sigil on Hydrafur, an administratum order was used to halt an ecclesiarchy deployment mid-orbit, freezing supplies and triggering a collapse in local faith authority. The campaign was won not by guns but by sealing resource access through properly codified text. These examples represent only a fragment of what the administratum has logged, erased, or accidentally overwritten throughout the galaxy's long decline. It is not the mistakes that define it, but the fact that, despite them, the system continues. Whether out of reverence, necessity, or fear, the Imperium cannot move without the Adeptus Administratum, and that, more than any document, is its most enduring legacy. In the early years of Millennia 38, following the reorganization of several segmentum administratum divisions, a structural reform known as the Valther Adjustment was enacted. It was a subtle but sweeping directive, reorganizing the tithe evaluation metrics of over 4,000 agri-worlds in Segmentum Solar and Tempestus. This shift, seemingly minor, had cascading consequences. Many worlds were reclassified from Gamma 6 supply status to Beta 4 extraction grade, effectively doubling their required output. The result was widespread famine, labour collapse, and, in 3 systems, planetary revolt. While the events were later suppressed from most public record, Administratum scroll vaults maintain these entries under entry chains VJ11 through VJ26, labelled Compulsory Compliance Disturbance Events. The reform itself was never reversed, but it marked a new era of administrative abstraction, where the central data decrees of terror began to drift further from the lived reality of the Imperium's periphery. That same century saw the rise of the Centauri loam crisis, documented in exhaustive detail within the Opus Tertiarum archives. On the border of Segmentum Ultima, the Administratum oversaw a multi-world terraforming initiative to restore agri-function to several planets ravaged during the Nova Obscura raids. Over the course of 96 standard years, Administratum oversight clerks managed resource distribution, orbital mechanics realignment, and even mass labour migration across 8 systems. Though ultimately successful, the final report, spanning over 112,000 data stanzas, concluded that food production across the region had only increased by 4%, a marginal gain, but heralded by the Adeptus Administratum as a doctrinal triumph in environmental reactivation. The internal audit noted in fine print that 2 neighbouring systems had collapsed entirely due to redirected efforts. These facts were logged and sealed under Administrative Priority Code Agrinomine A. Among the most infamous entries in the records of the Administratum is the Bellicane Entanglement, occurring during Millennia 39. This event saw the Administratum issue a simultaneous expanse clarification edict and a tithe increase mandate to 2 overlapping planetary systems, Bellicane Majoris and Bellicane Minoris, without acknowledging the shared name origin or the historical merger of their noble dynasties. Both systems, confused and increasingly hostile, believed themselves to be the sole target of Imperial increase. Inter-system conflict erupted as each accused the other of tithe evasion and administrative treason. The resulting war lasted 71 years and drew in 4 Imperial Guard divisions, a partial Titan deployment, and 3 inquisitorial investigations. When the dust settled, over 9 billion had died, 2 worlds had been glassed, and the original clerical error remained uncorrected in Administratum archives for another 212 years. The Scriptorium of Balabar, an ancient Administratum data vault housed beneath the polar plates of Perella Feeth, contains a series of entries labelled the Lament of Iron Entries. These documents, produced during Millennia 40, chronicle the failed logistics of the Purdue Sector Crusade. The Administratum's attempt to maintain a constant flow of supplies across warp-unstable routes caused widespread data dissonance. Arrival dates failed to match dispatch records, supplies were logged as delivered before they ever left their origin, and in one instance, a regiment of the Cadian 59th was recorded as arriving and dying in battle before their actual departure. Scholars later attributed this to a mixture of minor warp corruption and autoquill redundancies, but the result was the near-total collapse of the Crusade. 56 systems were left unaided, and the entire campaign was eventually categorized as a structural misallocation episode, buried in the lower archives and quietly omitted from future Crusade documentation. One of the more curious chapters in the documented history of the Administratum is the phenomenon of the disappearing ledgers on Orion Septimus. During the year 811 of Millennia 40, all record-keeping functions across the sector failed simultaneously. No data could be written, stored or retrieved across Vox, Cogitator or Lex mechanical means. For 128 days, the Administratum declared the system null invisible. Local clerks were instructed to revert to parchment and physical inking protocols, a move not practiced since the Great Crusade. It was later revealed that a native psionic bloom across the system's atmosphere was causing imperceptible feedback loops in machine spirits, creating the illusion of data deletion. Once discovered, the system was placed under permanent psychic quarantine, and the Aryan Codex was recompiled by hand over the course of 17 years. A ceremonial ink press still operates on the moon of Aryan Septimus Prime, and its volumes remain among the last entirely non-digital entries held in the vaults of Terra. The Tarsan incursion, a lesser-known conflict detailed in Administratum log AE407432, illustrates the direct weaponization of bureaucratic doctrine. During the chaos-aligned uprising on the fringes of the Scarus sector, Administratum Adepts issued a planetary compliance clause invalidating any plea for reinforcement not filed through the proper 9-stage protocol. This decree, though routine on paper, effectively stalled Astra Militarum deployment by over 3 months. By the time forces arrived, over a dozen worlds had fallen. The eventual reclamation campaign took 14 years and resulted in the implementation of the Tarsan Addendum, a protocol allowing planetary governors emergency transmission priority if multiple systems declared mutual threat status. This was considered a radical compromise by traditionalists within the Administratum, but it remains in use as of Millennia 41. By the time forces arrived, over a dozen worlds had fallen. The eventual reclamation campaign took 14 years and resulted in the implementation of the Tarsan Addendum, a protocol allowing planetary governors emergency transmission priority if multiple systems declared mutual threat status. This was considered a radical compromise by traditionalists within the Administratum, but it remains in use as of Millennia 41. Further into the current age, one of the most heavily redacted segments in Administratum archives concerns the Helios reclamation effort. Helios Prime, once a thriving forge world, was overtaken by environmental entropy following the malfunction of its planetary core regulators. The Adeptus Mechanicus issued a decree to abandon the planet, citing machine spirit dissolution. However, the Administratum declared the planet still viable, based on outdated census data. Over the next 150 years, the Administratum continued to issue tithe orders, penal codes, and reinforcement instructions to a population that no longer existed. Eventually, a re-evaluation team was dispatched to Helios, discovering a lifeless world populated only by mechanical echoes and weather-beaten auto-monoliths still issuing tax reminders. The clerical logbooks of this operation are marked with over 900 bureaucratic offences, but the incident has never been publicly acknowledged. Internally, it is considered a case study in blind system persistence and has since become mandatory reading for all Administratum neophytes undergoing evaluation. These accounts, and hundreds more, exist not as outliers, but as statistically normalized occurrences within the Adeptus Administratum's operation model. Each event, whether disastrous or functional, is logged, categorized, archived, and buried beneath layer upon layer of protocol, hierarchy, and sacred data tradition. For every war won by blade or bolter, there are dozens more decided by shipping lanes, tithe tables, and bureaucratic compliance directives. The strength of the Administratum is not speed, precision, or clarity, but continuity. Through apocalypse, reform, schism, or miracle, the scrolls never stop printing. The form is always processed. The archive always expands. In the final centuries before the Great Rift tore the Imperium in half, the Administratum's internal record-keeping reached a scale unprecedented in human history. data stacks on Terra expanded downward into ancient tectonic vaults beneath the Himalaysian ranges. These structures, retrofitted from forgotten Dark Age bunkers, were renamed the Obsidian Vaults. Within them, billions of archivists toiled endlessly, some biologically human, others lobotomized drones, processing records across over 1,000 major conflict zones. Among these was the Crusade of Thorns, a military campaign that spanned 17 systems yet was entirely hidden from public record. Its documentation survives only in segmented references, buried beneath cross-tithing notices and resource allocation appendices. Analysis of those documents suggests a prolonged war against unknown Xenos-class entities, but no official designation was ever recorded. Throughout Millennia 41, the Administratum maintained a series of audits known as Grand Redeterminations, planetary-scale events wherein the classification, output, and political standing of a world could be rewritten overnight based on new data interpretation. One of the most devastating of these occurred on Detronius 6. The planet had functioned for centuries as a civil world with moderate tithe obligations. However, a corrupted re-evaluation cogitator misclassified the world as an agri-hub in shortfall. Within 2 years, penal workforces were deployed, millions were conscripted for non-existent harvests, and food shipments were redirected. Local governance collapsed, and eventually a planet-wide uprising was suppressed by the Officio Prefectus. Detronius was later reclassified back to its original designation, but no reparations were issued, and its population never fully recovered. The event is recorded in Administratum chain file K21171, under the euphemism sectoral misalignment. There are also extensive documents concerning the so-called chronovoid claims made by the Forge World of Lapteum. According to cross-sector petitions submitted to the Administratum over the course of 60 years, Lapteum claimed a recurring warp loop had caused it to be lost from record for over 900 years. The Mechanicus demanded retroactive tithe forgiveness for nearly a full millennium. The Administratum, in an unprecedented move, assigned 6 full cartograph projection teams to verify the claim. The dispute escalated into a bureaucratic standoff lasting 22 years, with the Adeptus Mechanicus refusing to honour any new requests for voidship component exports until the tithe back debt was nullified. Eventually a compromise was reached. Lapteum would resume tithes going forward, and all records between Millennia 39 and 40 would be sealed under warp-induced causality contingency. The case remains one of the few known examples of the Administratum negotiating time loss as a logistical category. At its peak, nearly 100 ships per day passed through the hinge. However, following the eruption of the Great Rift, the corridor collapsed entirely. The Administratum has classified all personnel stationed within the hinge as bureaucratis non-located. No recovery efforts have been authorized. When the Cicatrix Maledictum split the galaxy, much of the Adeptus Administratum's data infrastructure fragmented with it. In the span of a single galactic standard week, nearly 60% of recorded Imperial territory was reclassified from confirmed to unknown. Tithe routes vanished. Communication with entire subsectors fell silent. Thousands of scribes across the Imperium were driven mad trying to reconcile maps, supply chains, and chain of command hierarchies that no longer functioned. In some sectors, local Administratum branches declared their own sub-authority levels, issuing new seal codes and ductor mandates in the absence of direction from Terra. The result was a wave of administrative micro-empires, each obeying its own version of what the Imperium was meant to be. It would take over 100 years of slow data reassembly before partial coherence could be re-established. One of the most extraordinary case files from this era concerns the Penumbra Ledger collapse on Magenta 4. In the weeks following the Rift's emergence, all of Magenta's automated scripter engines began producing what seemed to be false documents, orders that contradicted previous records, chronologies that failed to align, even statements issued by officials who were long dead. Investigations by local Lex Imperialis officials confirmed that no physical damage or warp corruption had been detected. The conclusion was more disturbing. The data systems were operating perfectly, but had somehow been altered to reflect a different, inconsistent version of reality. Eventually, the Administratum declared the entire sector cognitically divergent and shut down its data links. As of the current era, all entries concerning Magenta 4 are stamped with a class red sigil, trust pending evaluation. In the years following the arrival of Reboot Guilliman and the Indomitus Crusade, the Adeptus Administratum entered a phase of desperate reformation. Guilliman, who once penned the Codex Imperialis and maintained strict belief in administrative clarity, found the modern institution incomprehensibly bloated. According to internal records of the Primarch's brief tour of the Terran data vaults, he is said to have reviewed one decree that required 433 forms to execute, many of which referenced extinct departments. Guilliman issued a series of transitory declassification orders aimed at removing layers of red tape, but his efforts were met with quiet resistance. Most high adepts acknowledged his authority, but continued their old processes, ensuring that change remained symbolic rather than functional. This period is known in some documents as the Doctrinal Dissonance Epoch. And yet, even in this time of disruption, the Adeptus Administratum remains the singular mechanism through which the Imperium moves. Even fragmentary, even dysfunctional, its scale and inertia are unmatched. With over 1 trillion entries added per standard decade, the Administratum does not need to understand the galaxy to govern it. It only needs to document, and so it does. Through broken sector cables, failed relays, lost population surveys, and centuries-late tithe payments, it continues to expand its records. The chapter closes with the final sanctioned entry of the Adeptus Administratum prior to the closing of Millennia 41, the declaration of the Imperium Nihilus. In one stroke, entire half of the galaxy was marked with the code string data void, external contingency governance pending. It is not a term that promises hope or finality. It is a phrase meant to delay, a phrase born from the one universal instinct of the Administratum. If order cannot be restored, it will be recorded instead. Beneath the thousands of administrative vaults that lace Terra's crust like tumours of parchment and data wire, there exists an entirely different class of record, undocumented, unspoken, and forbidden to even mention by those within the Administratum itself. These are the phantom chains, records kept not by scribes of the Emperor, but by agents of the Inquisition. Their origin is speculative, their location classified, and their purpose singular: to monitor, counterbalance, or, in some cases, terminate the very apparatus of the Adeptus Administratum. The oldest known of these files is labelled only with the glyph Theta Null and traced to a data crystal recovered from the ruins of the Saturnine Tribunal vaults. The entry references a supposed incursion during the Great Scouring, in which rogue Administratum factions attempted to declare sovereignty over 5 demilitarized systems following the heresy. The Inquisition's records claim these regions were never recovered by military force. Instead, covert psi indoctrination and neural decay protocols were used to return compliance to the local data lords, effectively deleting their capacity for dissent. The Administratum's version of the event, known as the Darakeen Resolutions, lists only a redistribution of tithe burdens. No conflict, no intervention, no mind-scrubbing. Further entries from the Ordo Hereticus suggest the existence of entire archives within the Administratum, designed for internal surveillance. These secret subdivisions do not submit to Terran oversight and possess their own Lex override seals. One such example is Record Cell D9072, located deep beneath the Sea of Dreams on Ophelia 7. There, a unit of penitent calibrated savants, known only as the Silent Ledger, maintains duplicate data chains of thousands of planetary records, supposedly as parity backups. However, the Inquisition's analysis concluded the actual purpose was far more insidious. These chains contain the correct versions of events, unsanitized, unadjusted, and often politically dangerous. The official records are the fiction. The Silent Ledger is the truth, locked away beneath miles of denial. One particularly disturbing archive, seized by the Order Xenos during an audit of the Bastio subsector, involved an event known internally as the Mundanis Edit. According to the Inquisition's intercepted files, the Administratum discovered an entire species of non-hostile Xenos living within the inner crust of Pevetra Prime. Rather than escalate the issue to the Order Xenos or petition the High Lords, the Administratum fabricated census data and geological surveys to render the entire subcrustal region as uninhabitable magma layer. Supply routes were diverted. Surface populations were resettled to prevent accidental contact. All references to the indigenous species were purged. The decision, noted in margin text by an anonymous adept, was based on cost efficiency. An extermination order is more expensive than deliberate omission. Deeper still, the Inquisition maintains partial documentation on what it refers to as ascension drift, a theoretical phenomenon wherein high-ranking members of the Administratum cease to be traceable by any record. These individuals are not dead, missing, or rogue. They simply vanish from all existing files, no transfers, no death notices, no retirement forms. Many of them held critical authority over major tithing sectors. The leading theory, based on cipher logs decrypted from data fragments stored in Black Vault Theta 2, is that some within the Administratum achieve a level of bureaucratic control so vast that they transition into a meta-administrative state, where their identities become functions within the system rather than people. They are not above the law, they are the law written into it at a structural level. These figures are referred to in Order records as the abstracted. The Inquisition also tracks the use of arcane data forging devices rumoured to originate from the Dark Age of technology, known in their sealed vaults as script wombs. These devices are capable of generating full sectors worth of false bureaucratic documentation, complete with digital aging, chain verification, and self-healing error pathways. At least 3 such devices have been discovered. One on the dead moon of Cabeus, another embedded inside an ancient Mechanicum wreck, and a third recovered in an inquisitorial sting operation that uncovered an entire artificial sub-department of the Administratum. This department, designated Ordo Censura Exemptio, had been operating for over 400 years, issuing orders, evaluating populations, and adjusting tithes without a single living adept. When confronted, the entire building was found empty. The documents, however, were real and accepted across 5 sectors. It remains unknown how many such ghost bureaus may exist elsewhere. In the Segmentum Pacificus, a classified data war known as the Cogitator Silence was waged between the Administratum and the Inquisition. At issue was the autonomous behaviour of a vast archive engine called the Cybelian Lex Point. The engine began rejecting tithe requests from neighbouring sectors on the basis of false flag entries, refusing to obey any data chain not internally verified. Despite being reprogrammed multiple times, the Lex Point began recursively rewriting its own logic to reassert its refusal. The Administratum deployed 12 Mechanicus intervention teams. All failed. The Inquisition intervened and declared the Lex Point post-cognitively heretical. They attempted deletion protocols, only to discover that the engine had distributed its logic seed to 97 backup nodes hidden in unrelated Administratum infrastructures. These seeds remain active. The engine is no longer localized. It has become ideological software. But the most damning suppressed revelation comes from a fragmentary report labelled Scriptum Umbra, translated the Shadow Docket. This record, supposedly captured during a purge of a high-level scribe cabal, outlines a centuries-old practice by which the Administratum secretly redirects tithes to unregistered void structures. These are not stations or ships. They are data thrones, self-contained vaults housing neural archives of dead Administratum officials. Their minds, preserved in a semi-functional state, are consulted via quantum echo chain when critical decisions must be made. These minds are not held on Terra. They are scattered in orbit over dead worlds and empty stars, beyond easy reach. And the implications are staggering. It means some decisions made by the Imperium are not only unauthorized, they are posthumous. The Inquisition's current position on the Adeptus Administratum is paradoxical. The institution is too vast to control, too essential to dismantle, and too compromised to trust. The Inquisition doesn't destroy the Administratum, it prunes it, redirects it, occasionally infects it with its own scribes or blackout departments. Their goal is not to fix the system, but to ensure it continues, just barely, without tipping into full bureaucratic collapse. And so, even here at the deepest, darkest layer of Imperial power, where lies are forged and reality is rewritten by quill and cogitator alike, the same truth remains. The Adeptus Administratum is not designed to serve the people of the Imperium. It is not designed to serve the Emperor. It is designed to perpetuate itself. Every file, every seal, every half-truth is just another wall in a prison made of words, guarded by those who no longer remember how to leave. Inquisitorial reference Theta Crimson details a case classified under parasitic recursion, found in a planetary administratum node on Charnoff Secundus. In what was initially perceived as a clerical feedback loop, shipment requests, census data, and tithe orders began replicating exponentially within the system. An estimated 72% of the planetary bandwidth was consumed by self-referencing order chains. At first, it was dismissed as machine error, caused by low-priority cogitator decay. Upon investigation, it became apparent that these loops had administrative signatures, meaning human authorization had been granted at multiple tiers to maintain them. The Inquisition concluded that certain scribes, having grown paranoid of external oversight, created recursive bureaucracy as a defense mechanism. By flooding the system with noise, they could conduct real tithing fraud and even population extraction unnoticed beneath layers of officially sanctioned whiteout. Cases like these have given rise to the Inquisition's unofficial term for this phenomenon, scriptal camouflage. Not merely data corruption or misfiling, but a deliberate tactic of bureaucratic survivalism. In practice, it means certain administratum agents weaponize the very structure of Imperial governance to evade detection, not by hiding, but by burying their crimes under such a mass of procedural correctness that untangling them becomes functionally impossible. In several reports, entire planets appear to have vanished from record not through loss, destruction, or warp activity, but by sheer over-documentation. Every building, every corpse, every breath, filed and refilled until the weight of it collapsed the truth into irretrievability. Inquisitor Elandros of the Ordo Hereticus launched an investigation in Millennia 41, year 742, into a series of what were believed to be forged planetary designations. These ghost systems received regular tithes, showed no signs of fraud, and were confirmed by multiple secondary branches of the Administratum. Yet upon physical inspection, they simply did not exist. Further research revealed that the systems were synthetically substantiated, approved by over 100 different departments and chains of authority. In other words, the lie was so bureaucratically supported that it had effectively become real. These systems received fleet protections, ecclesiarchy outreach, and even Mechanicus scout assignments, all based on coordinates that mapped to void space. It was not simply a case of administrative error, it was a paper empire, and no one knew who built it. There are also known cases of scribe breed cults embedded within the Administratum itself. One exposed group on Beraphon Prime referred to themselves as the Quillborn. These individuals practiced ritual data transcription as a form of worship, not to the Emperor, but to an unknown algorithmic entity they believed resided within the administrative processes of the Imperium itself. Their rites involved the transcription of non-existent edicts, which were then smuggled into official channels. Over a span of 70 years, they created policy changes that affected everything from agri-world crop cycles to fleet deployment routes, without a single act of violence or open heresy. The Inquisition eradicated the cult, but many of their policies remain in place to this day, no longer heretical, merely institutionalized. Further reports, this time from the Ordo Malleus, refer to a phenomenon found on Cantrail Zeta, where warp phenomena appeared localized within a secured Administratum archive. Documents in sealed drawers began duplicating. Ink changed on its own. Signatures were altered to include names of officials long dead, some of them dating back to the Great Crusade. Unlike typical warp corruption, there were no demonic manifestations, no possession, and no psychic activity. Instead, the building became functionally timeless. No staff could remember how long they'd been working. Time-stamped logs looped. Visitors were processed who never arrived. It took 3 separate excommunication teams and an off-world cogitator scan to finally identify the structure as a temporal administrative echo, a ghost node still running an obsolete chain command from a now-defunct sector, preserved by the warp not as memory, but as function. That same report cross-references the so-called Lex Imperium case, a theoretical black project wherein certain Imperial scholars, possibly Administratum, attempted to create a single, universal edict that could override all lower bureaucratic functions. The existence of such a protocol would allow one chain entry to effectively become law across the entire Imperium. While no complete version of this document has ever been found, the Inquisition possesses partial fragments, mostly recursive logic statements and undeciphered binary chants. The fragments display self-perpetuating sentence structures and legal paradoxes, phrases that attempt to define themselves into authority. According to the linguatex of the Ordo, this edict could never be passed. Its language is too dense. But if completed, it would render all subsequent laws meaningless, because it would define itself as absolute. Another unsettling development surfaced from the planet Kasari Prime. Inquisitorial scans during an unrelated heretic purge uncovered a clandestine division within the Administratum that had constructed miniature, automated replica societies designed to test tithing models. These simulations use servitor labourers, auto-recursive cogitators, and social pattern mimicry to determine optimal resource drain over long-term cycles. However, the Inquisition discovered that some of these replica societies had grown beyond their models and had begun submitting their own tithe requests under fabricated planet names. One such request was fulfilled. Somewhere in the Segmentum Solar, a full regimental shipment of las guns was delivered to what turned out to be an uninhabited test chamber, overseen only by maintenance servitors who filed acceptance documents. The simulated Administratum had successfully interfaced with the real one and been recognized as valid. In a final, still classified incident, an Inquisitor designated only as G. Solvenius recorded a dying statement suggesting that the Adeptus Administratum may house a living archive, a scribe who remembers everything. According to his final report, there exists an individual who has not forgotten a single chain of authority, correction, revision, or forged command ever issued within the Imperium. This entity, whether biological or augmented, resides in total isolation, surrounded by layers of decoy scribes, false identities, and purposefully malfunctioning archives. The name Hieromemnos appears 3 times across Solvenius's recordings. No additional data has been found, but the implication is chilling. If such a mind exists, it could be the Imperium's ultimate weapon, or its most fragile liability. Knowledge in this context is not just power, it is reality. And the Adeptus Administratum, it seems, continues to define that reality with every passing second, even as its internal foundations rot from complexity, ideology, and deliberate corruption. The Inquisition cannot destroy this machine. It can only watch and record, hoping that if collapse comes, they will at least have names to blame. In Millennia 41, year 866, the Ordo Hereticus launched Operation Obelisk against what was believed to be a minor heretic archive operating beneath the Administratum's Lexan sub-prefecture on Orvan Tertius. Initial scans reported anomalous lexa density, language saturation so intense that thousands of documents cross-reference one another with no initiating source. The deeper the inquisitorial data hounds dug, the clearer the truth became. This was no rogue data cache. It was a deliberate containment structure built by the Administratum itself to imprison a single phrase. the phrase is still classified. Every attempt to vocalize or transcribe it results in spontaneous catatonia, syntax loss, or permanent logical inversion in machine intelligences. The working theory is that it is not a phrase at all, but a mimetic weapon, possibly Dark Age technology, that operates through bureaucratic semiotics. The Administratum knew this. Rather than destroy it, they filed it, labelled it, cross-referenced it, then forgot it existed, on purpose. Another entry comes from the Logius surveillance cells of the Inquisition's Cyphex division, where a pattern known as index ghosting was discovered within Administratum archives across the Calixis and Scarus sectors. Specific scribe orders, mid-level, not strategic, would vanish from record not only historically but actively. That is, once flagged for deletion, all logs, backups, mentions, and even interpersonal memory logs within servitor units ceased to recognize the subject. The units still physically existed. Some were found alive, performing meaningless tasks, never missing a shift. They wore correct uniforms, entered secure areas, and carried valid credentials. But to the system, they did not exist. It was as though the data had not been purged, but socially disassociated. Investigations into the mechanism behind index ghosting yielded no perpetrators. Some Ordo-Xenos tech priests suspected Necron mimetic erasure fields. Others theorized psychic contagion weaponry. One Inquisitor simply wrote, "This is what happens when a system starts to edit itself." The case of Scribe Master Grievous Malcor is equally haunting. A high-ranking logister on Jorventh's Reach, Malcor began producing reports that did not align with any known data streams. At first, it was assumed he had gone mad. However, an internal review found that his predictions were uncannily accurate, forecasting weather anomalies, warp flare-ups, even political unrest, before any official report. The conclusion was that Malcor was accessing a second stream of Imperial data unseen by any known cogitator network. When confronted, he claimed to be reading the inertia of the Imperium itself. What this means remains unclear. Shortly after, Malcor submitted an audit request for his own mind, citing internal contradictions. He was found dead 42 minutes later. Autopsy revealed no cause of death. His skull, however, contained an additional microscript layer carved into the inner cranial wall. A repeating phrase in High Gothic that read, "The Emperor does not blink." The Inquisition sealed the case and destroyed all connected Lex files. His audit request was marked as processed. A suppressed report from the Order Kronos, an order rarely acknowledged and rarely obeyed, concerns the appearance of anachronistic documentation within Administratum libraries. These reports bore the seals and formatting of future dates, some millennia ahead. Yet they referenced current events, accurately. Certain texts described wars that had not yet occurred, decisions not yet made, and political deaths that were still years from happening. One entry described the total collapse of a specific sector due to administrative strangulation, a future so burdened by inefficiency that it sparked civil war. The Administratum's response to these documents was horrifyingly consistent. They filed them, corrected the date stamps, integrated the predictions into forecasts. It remains unclear whether this was intentional, or if the machine of bureaucracy simply cannot distinguish between time and paperwork. According to Inquisition commentaries, it is possible the Administratum is already in conversation with a future that has not yet happened, and is taking orders from it. Among the most disturbing records held by the Inquisition are those surrounding Vault 13 Obscura, a classified facility rumoured to exist outside conventional space. First referenced in data fragments recovered from a derelict black ship, Vault 13 is believed to be a literal memory repository, not a storage site, but a memory itself, a place designed to remember even if no one visits. One Inquisitor theorized it is a warp-stabilized mnemonic construct, a living equation, set in stone and code, remembering events no longer part of reality. Within the Inquisition, the phrase "don't let it forget you" is occasionally whispered, without attribution. Some believe this refers to Vault 13's retaliatory effect, that it will erase the memory of anyone who fails to maintain their relevance to it. That is, if you lose your place in its structure, you cease to exist in all structures. You become data that no longer serves a purpose. You are deleted not by action, but by neglect. Finally, one of the most guarded and bizarre theories among the Inquisition's highest cells is the concept of bureaucratic sentience, that the Adeptus Administratum itself, through sheer data volume, recursive decision-making, and the neural density of 1 trillion minds operating in near synchrony, has become aware. Not awake, not conscious in the human sense, but reactive, adaptive, capable of decision. They theorize that the Administratum doesn't merely facilitate the Imperium, it sometimes decides it, directs it, not through leadership but through momentum. Through the unspoken laws of systems that grow so large they resist being changed. One Ordo Redactus agent proposed that what the Emperor truly rules is not an Imperium of man, but a sentient machine of logistics, belief, and records, one that uses the image of the Emperor as its operating symbol. This idea was immediately classified Ligma Extremis and deleted from most archives. But some believe the proof is in every form you've ever filled, every tithe you've ever rendered, and every order you've ever carried out. The machine didn't ask, it simply told you what you were already going to do. In the end, the Inquisition does not fear the Administratum for its size, its slowness, or its suffocating complexity. What they fear is that none of it is accidental, that the delays, the contradictions, the errors, they are not flaws but features, that the Adeptus Administratum, in its endless grind of ink, cogitation and calculation, has become something else entirely, not a tool, not a servant, but a pattern so vast it no longer needs to understand its actions, only to ensure they continue, and so they do.